Welcome to Trade Finance Talks. My name is Deepesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global, and today we're at Commodities Trading Week, and I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Watts, Director at HR Maritime, talking about some of the real challenges that the shipping, freight and logistics industry are facing right now with regards to supply chain disruption, sanctions and various other regimes. Richard, welcome to Trade Finance Talks.
Thank you very much.
So quick introduction, who are you, where are you from and what do you do?
My name is Richard Watts. I am the Director of HR Maritime. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland, and I've been working in commodity trading companies nearly all my life, either within them or working with them and helping them with various problems.
Thank you very much. So we've heard a lot about the end of the big boat era, I think is termed, with regards to maritime disruption. We've seen what's happened with some of the severe droughts in the Panama Canal right now, some of the congestions in places like Long Beach. We've also seen hugely increased transit times, which leads to increased carbon dioxide emissions. How did these supply chain woes really impact commodity trading?
As far as commodity trading is concerned, the shipping is a very, very big part of it. And it's interesting, when you look at the transportation of goods around the world, how long it actually takes to move goods from A to B, as long as the supply chain is well planned and well organised, it doesn't really matter that much, except for it will have an impact on the financing costs. It's when things change that's a problem. It's when things are not as planned or as expected that you have a major issue. And so we've seen more and more disruptions over the last couple of years. We saw the disruption within the Suez Canal, where the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, and that suddenly was the biggest problem that ever hit shipping because vessels had to start deviating. The vessel was stuck for 6 days. It wasn't an awful long time, but we seem to be seeing more and more problems that are coming up, more and more big disruptions. Maybe the supply chains, the global supply chains, are more dependent on more and more delicate systems that are in place. But I think that a lot of the supply chains, a lot of different trading companies they're having to build more robust systems. They're having to have more contingency plans in place. And so when we look across the whole range, when we look at what's going on with the Red Sea at the moment, the fact that vessels are having to deviate around, what's going on in the Panama Canal, what's going on with the conflict in Israel, what's going on in the Black Sea and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And those are things that are okay, they're kind of calculated now. We know where we stand, more or less. We know how to handle them. If a vessel can't go through the Red Sea, then it can still go round the Cape of Good Hope. If it can't go through the Panama Canal, it can still go round the Magdalene Straits. If we were to end up seeing the Straits of Hormuz closed, then that would be the world's supply of oil, which suddenly gets cut off overnight. If we were to see a conflict between China and Taiwan, then that would be a much, 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 much bigger impact on our daily business.
Thank you very much. Certainty is great, but sometimes things do go awry, and we can look at Dali's collision with the Key Bridge in Baltimore as an example of that. And I guess that leads me on to my next question, which is how and why is it important for buyers and sellers to really understand those contractual obligations, especially when things go wrong?
Well, the problem is when everything goes right, you don't really need a contract. Everyone's happy. Everyone is happy just to go along and say, okay, well, we've been paid, we've been delivered, we're good. It's when things go wrong that people start laying blame and people start pointing fingers. And so that's when you really need to start identifying, okay, what does the contract actually say? And it's times like that you start looking at the contract and realize that it's not anywhere near as accurate as it should be. But also sometimes we just don't actually understand what is included in the contract. There was a client of mine not too long ago where they had a cargo which is going from Asia to the east coast of the United States. And so these vessels would always go through the Red Sea. They go through the Suez Canal. However, this was in January, and this was just after the attack started happening. This is after vessels started deviating, and so the ship owner decided to deviate. Then the question is, who is responsible for that added voyage, the longer voyage? And it ended up being a dispute going back and forth because it didn't say anything in the contract in terms of who was responsible. Contracts going forward, they did clarify it. They made sure it was clear who was responsible. And as long as it's priced in, nobody really cares who's responsible. But it wasn't, and that ended up with a dispute, and then they ended up getting in a fight with the ship owner.
Richard, why is it also important for trading companies to understand their positions with regards to international commercial terms or Incoterms? And can you give any case studies? I've heard X-Works is a pretty bad Incoterm to use.
Well, it depends on your point of view, I guess. I mean, the Incoterms themselves, they are really the foundation of our business. They are probably one of the most important aspects of what we do on a day-to-day basis, and they determine some very, very important aspects of our contract. And so they will determine where is the risk transferred from one party to another, but also who is going to pay for what costs. That being said, the Incoterms are not going to govern the transfer of title. They're not going to say when does the payment have to be made. They're not going to cover a lot of other areas that people seem to get confused and think they do cover. And so it's important, first of all, to be very clear in terms of what is covered under the Incoterms, what we've agreed, to try and avoid using what we call hybrid Incoterms, where we take one Incoterm and stick it onto another. I've often seen FOB plus freight. FOB plus freight is cost and freight. But then I've also seen FOB plus freight delivered at destination, which is just very confusing. I'm not sure what that means. I've also seen ones where you have the quality determined at the loading port and the quantity determined at the discharging port, which gets very confusing itself. And I even saw a contract recently where it said DES, which is an Incoterm that doesn't exist anymore, as per the latest Incoterms. Now, does that mean DES as per the latest when it existed?
Yeah.
Or does that mean the replacement of DES now? And so these things need to be clear within the contract.
No, absolutely. Sanctions regimes, extremely difficult to keep up with and really important to keep up with. Why is it important to ensure you're compliant, and how can you do that? And I think you have some examples of times when sanctions regimes aren't adhered to, or it's actually quite difficult to keep up with the changing nature of those regimes.
It's interesting. It's become something that's more and more important. And so it used to be something 20 years ago where there were sanctions against Iraq, and there were companies which were trying to skirt them, and it was talked about. I remember there was Australian Wheat Board had a lot of issues because they were in breach of the oil for food program with Iraq. Nowadays, it has become something that if a company is in breach of sanctions, then it can take the company down. I mean, if you look at BNP Paribas, they ended up suffering about a $10 billion fine because of sanctions. They closed down their trade finance business. And so this is something that the trading companies, they've realized the consequences of this. And in terms of the different sanctions themselves, it's a question of what your exposure is and what you're involved with. Some companies take it a lot more seriously than others, but they all should take it very seriously. I had a client years ago who had loaded a cargo of bitumen from Dubai. The problem is that Dubai doesn't export bitumen. Bitumen comes from Iran. And the shipping documentation was written in Farsi. And this was something that ended up within a bank where the people working in the bank were Arabic speaking. And so it was obvious immediately, and this was found out. Now, this was the bank telling their client off. That didn't end up in the hands of the regulators. Today it would. And this is something that I think you need to be very, very careful of. We've just had Venezuela. We had a window within the Venezuelan sanctions, and then that closed again. And so it was very important for vessels which were involved in that business to complete loading, to complete discharging, to get paid, and for any costs under the charter party all to be paid before the 18th of April. And that ended up imposing a very, very hard deadline, which if you missed, you would have mountains of problems.
Well, I think one of those problems would be charges, and you know, we're talking demurrage here. Detention is also another very common shipping charge. Why? And you know, we're not talking about school detentions here. I think they can be a bit more severe than that. Why are some of these charges really important to understand for vessel operators?
It's just the sheer amount of money we're talking about. I mean, when you take a large oil tanker, then the demurrage rate, the penalty for a delay of 1 day, can go up to, I was dealing with a vessel the other day, with $100,000 per day. So when you've got a vessel that you know is $100,000 per day that it's costing you, and this vessel in particular, it turned up at a loading port, there was something that hadn't been negotiated in the charter party, an option hadn't been negotiated, and so the intended loading couldn't take place. So they had to load from a different terminal at the loading port. The vessel ended up waiting 17 days for this then to load at the correct, sorry, not 17 days, 27 days. 27 days is very similar to 2.7 million. So you can end up talking about some very, very, very large amounts of money. And it's something that you can end up in dispute, but also you can feel quite comfortable that your counterparty is responsible for the delay because there's a contract that says they are. But then can you enforce it? Can you actually get that money back from your counterparty? And so that adds another level of complexity into the problem.
Thank you very much. Richard, final question. What are your top tips for commodity traders to really look out for and watch out for and manage and mitigate risk when it comes to commodity trading, especially in today's very uncertain landscape?
I mean, the list would go on a long way. It's one of the main ones that I would really go for is if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. And so don't go chasing after these bits of business that you think, oh, it's going to make me a fortune. It's probably going to be more problem than it's worth. I would also say the devil's in the details, and so make sure that you are careful about the details and you look into the details. And we often say that you make your money in trading and you lose it in operations. You don't need to, but it's very easy to lose money in the operation side of the business, and that's where you need to be very, very careful, because a wonderful P&L that's then lost through operations still ends up a loss.
That was Richard Watts, Director at HR Maritime, talking to Trade Finance Global at Commodity Trading Week London. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.